There's a stretch of road in western Texas, just beyond the small town of Pecos, that locals like to avoid after dark. The stretch of Highway 285, known to some as the Devil's Stretch, has a reputation, one that's whispered about in hushed voices at the local diner, or passed down as warnings to newcomers. The highway, though scenic during the day with sweeping views of the desert landscape, takes on a sinister air when night falls, the kind of quiet that wraps itself around you, presses on your chest, and fills your car with an eerie chill that no air conditioning can fix. It's on this stretch of road that Darren, a trucker from San Antonio, found himself in the early hours of a Monday morning. He had been driving for over 10 hours, hauling a load of supplies to a warehouse in Albuquerque. He had taken this route dozens of times before, always hoping to avoid the packed highways of I-10. But tonight was different. Something about the quietness of the road felt off, like it was too still. He had just crossed the border into Texas and was about 2 hours into the drive when the fog rolled in. It came quickly, thick and dense, creeping up from the low valleys and hugging the asphalt like a ghostly veil. Darren had seen fog before, but never like this. It was unnaturally quiet, the kind of quiet that made him uneasy. The headlights of his rig barely cut through the mist, and his speed dropped to a cautious crawl. As the miles ticked on, he couldn't shake the sensation that he wasn't alone. He checked his rearview mirror constantly, half expecting to see the red lights of another truck or car closing in behind him. But there was nothing, just the vast emptiness of the desert surrounding him. The only sound was the hum of the truck's engine and the rhythmic thump of the tires on the road. Then, about 30 miles north of Pecos, it happened. Darren's headlights caught something in the distance just off the road. At first, he thought it was a trick of the fog, but as he got closer, he realized it was a figure, a man standing alone by the side of the highway. He was wearing a long, dark coat, and his face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. As Darren's truck approached, the figure didn't move. He just stood there, perfectly still. Now, Darren wasn't a fool. He knew better than to stop on a lonely stretch of road like this. He'd heard the rumours. He'd heard the stories about people who got out of their cars only to disappear, never to be seen again. But as he passed the man, something tugged at his gut, a strange feeling that he couldn't explain. It was as if the man was calling to him, urging him to stop. But Darren didn't. He kept driving, the figure slowly fading from view in his side mirror. He breathed a sigh of relief. It was nothing, he told himself, just a hitchhiker, nothing unusual. Minutes passed and the fog thickened even more. He turned on his windshield wipers, but they barely made a dent in the moisture collecting on the glass. The low beams of his headlights barely illuminated the road ahead. That's when he heard it, the sound of a vehicle. Darren's first thought was that it was another truck, maybe someone trying to pass him. But when he glanced into his rearview mirror, there were no headlights. It wasn't a car. It was something else. A shiver ran down his spine as he realized the source of the sound. Footsteps. The heavy, deliberate steps of someone or something walking behind him. Darren's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He checked his mirrors again. Nothing. No other vehicle. No lights. But the footsteps persisted, growing louder and closer. His breath caught in his throat, his pulse racing. What was going on? He glanced around, his mind scrambling to make sense of it. The road ahead was as empty as it had been a few minutes ago. There were no houses, no gas stations, no sign of civilization, just him and the endless desert. Then, through the thickening fog, a figure appeared ahead of him, standing right in the middle of the road. It was the man, the one he'd seen earlier. He was standing with his back to the truck, not moving, as if waiting for Darren to approach. This time Darren could see more clearly. The man was much taller than he'd realized, and his coat was now billowing in the wind, as if it was alive, fluttering like a dark shadow. The hat was tilted at an odd angle, obscuring his face completely. Darren's instincts screamed at him to stop, to turn around, to get out of there. But his hands were frozen on the wheel. His truck kept moving forward, and no matter how hard he tried to press the brake, the truck continued to roll toward the figure. It was as if the vehicle had a mind of its own. Then, just as suddenly as the figure had appeared, it vanished. No sound, no movement. It was as if the man had melted into the fog, disappearing into thin air. Darren slammed his foot on the brake. The truck skidded to a stop, the wheels screeching against the asphalt. His heart was hammering in his chest, his breath coming in short gasps. He sat there, eyes wide, staring into the fog, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. No footsteps, no figure, no sign of life. For several long minutes, Darren sat frozen in place, his mind racing. Was he seeing things? Had he just imagined the entire thing? But the eerie feeling that had settled over him, the oppressive silence, wouldn't go away. It felt too real to be a hallucination. Finally, he took a deep breath and forced himself to look around. The highway was empty. The fog had parted slightly, revealing the faint outline of the road ahead. He checked his mirrors again, half expecting to see the figure following him, but there was nothing. No one. Darren didn't know how long he sat there, but eventually he forced himself to start the truck again. His hands were shaking as he gripped the wheel, and his foot hovered over the accelerator. He glanced at the fuel gauge. It was low, but not enough to justify stopping at the nearest station. He'd make it to Pecos soon enough. He glanced down the road, still empty. The fog had thinned, but the unsettling feeling hadn't left. He was still on edge, every sound, every shift of the truck's engine, sending his nerves into overdrive. But he pushed forward, his eyes never leaving the path ahead. About 10 minutes later, Darren noticed something strange. The road was starting to look familiar. It wasn't the highway he remembered. It had changed. The surroundings looked different, the landscape subtly altered. The landmarks he passed were wrong. He should have seen the first exit into Pecos by now, but it wasn't there. The road ahead didn't match the GPS, which was still useless, showing no signal. Panic slowly crept up his spine. He had been driving straight ahead, but now the highway felt like a loop, as though it had trapped him in its grasp. He turned the wheel, trying to make a left or right turn, but there were no exits. The road seemed to stretch on forever in the fog, and every time he checked his rearview mirror, he swore he saw the figure again. Just a fleeting shadow, but always there. It wasn't until the truck's headlights illuminated a dilapidated sign up ahead that Darren realized the truth. The sign, barely visible through the fog, read, "Welcome to the Devil's Stretch." Darren's heart stopped. He slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt. His breathing was shallow, his head spinning. He had crossed this road hundreds of times before, and this sign had never been there. The world around him seemed to grow colder, and the fog thickened once again, wrapping the truck in a suffocating embrace. Darren looked out the window, his eyes wide with terror. The figure appeared once more, standing in the distance, but this time it wasn't alone. A dozen figures, tall and shadowy, emerged from the fog, walking slowly toward him. Darren's mind screamed for him to drive, to run, but his body wouldn't move. The figures surrounded the truck, their faces hidden, their movements too fluid, too unnatural. The air grew heavier, pressing down on him. And then, in a voice that seemed to echo from all directions, the man spoke. "You've been warned." And with that, the fog closed in around him completely. The truck was never seen again. It had been a long day, and Jack was more than ready to get home. The sun was setting behind him as he drove along the winding country highway, a quiet, lonely stretch of road that seemed to stretch on forever. He had taken this route many times before, a shortcut through the backwoods that avoided the more crowded interstates. Jack was the kind of guy who preferred solitude, the kind of guy who enjoyed being alone with his thoughts. But tonight, as the light began to fade and the trees seemed to close in on him, something felt different. Jack hadn't heard much about this highway, just that it was a shortcut that some of the locals used when they needed to get to the neighbouring town. But there were whispers, rumours, that had always stuck with him. People talked about strange happenings on this stretch of road, strange occurrences that made many of the locals avoid it after dark. Of course, Jack didn't believe in such things. He was a man of logic, someone who trusted facts over folklore. Still, as the miles passed and the road grew darker, he began to feel an unsettling sense of being watched. The wind picked up, rattling the trees along the side of the road, and Jack shivered slightly. He rolled up the window, turning the heater on low, but it did little to ease the strange chill that seemed to permeate the air. He glanced at the gas gauge and sighed in relief. Plenty of fuel left to make it home. The headlights illuminated the long stretch of road ahead, but it felt as though they were only casting light on an endless, impenetrable darkness. As Jack rounded a bend in the road, something caught his eye. a flicker of movement in the trees. He slammed on the brakes, his heart racing. A figure, just barely visible in the shadows, had darted across the road. For a moment, Jack wondered if it was an animal, a deer perhaps, but the figure was too tall, too human in shape. His pulse quickened as he strained his eyes, trying to see clearly, but the figure had already disappeared into the woods. Probably just someone out for a walk, Jack muttered to himself, his voice shaky. But, as he resumed driving, the unsettling feeling lingered. The trees seemed to press in on him from both sides, their gnarled branches reaching toward the road like skeletal fingers. The wind had died down, and the world around him was eerily quiet. No animals, no birds, no distant sounds of life, just the hum of his engine and the occasional rustle of the wind in the branches. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. Minutes turned into hours, or so it seemed, and Jack started to wonder how far he had actually travelled. There had been no signs for miles, no road markers, no lights. It was as if the highway itself had swallowed him whole. He glanced at the GPS on his phone, but it was completely offline, no service. He cursed under his breath and kept driving, hoping that the next town would appear soon. But the road continued to stretch out before him, endless and desolate. It felt like the highway was pulling him deeper into the woods, farther away from civilization. And then, just as Jack thought he couldn't take it anymore, he saw it. A sign, or rather, a signpost. A rusted metal pole with a faded sign hanging from it, barely legible. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he neared it, squinting to make out the words. It read, Hollow Creek Road, 3 miles. Hollow Creek. He'd never heard of it before, but the sign offered some kind of reassurance, even though something about it seemed off. The sign was old, worn, almost as if it had been abandoned for years. Jack couldn't help but wonder why no one had bothered to replace it. He shrugged it off, telling himself it was just a small, forgotten town, nothing more. But a sense of unease gnawed at him, and he pressed on. The road grew narrower as he followed the sign's direction, the trees closing in tighter on either side of him. The headlights from his truck barely cut through the thickening darkness. He could hear the sound of something heavy, dragging along the side of the road, just beyond the reach of his lights. Jack's foot hovered over the brake, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop now. There was something deep inside him, some primal instinct, that told him he needed to get to Hollow Creek. It was as though the place was calling to him. Just as he was about to pass a large, twisted tree, something caught his eye. A figure stood on the side of the road, just outside the beam of his headlights. A man, or what looked like a man, was standing still, his face hidden beneath a hood. Jack's heart raced as the truck's headlights illuminated the figure. The man didn't move, didn't acknowledge Jack's presence. He just stood there, staring into the darkness. Jack slowed the truck, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "Hey!" he called out, unsure whether he wanted to stop or keep driving. The figure didn't respond. A deep sense of dread settled in his chest. But before Jack could make a decision, the man turned abruptly, walking into the woods without a sound. It was as though he had melted into the darkness itself. Jack stared after him for a moment, his mind racing. Who was that? What was he doing out here? Against his better judgment, Jack pressed the gas pedal and sped forward, the truck lurching slightly as he picked up speed. The figure was gone now, lost to the night. But the oppressive silence that followed made Jack uneasy. The feeling that he was being watched, followed, grew stronger with each passing mile. The trees began to thin out, and Jack thought he saw a faint light in the distance. A house? A street lamp? He wasn't sure. But it was something, anything to break the oppressive darkness that had begun to weigh on him. He pushed forward, his eyes fixed on the light ahead, until he realized it was not a house or a street lamp at all. It was a truck, an old rusted pickup truck, parked off the side of the road. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he slowed down, cautiously rolling past the vehicle. There was no one inside, but the truck's engine was running, the headlights casting long shadows across the road. He glanced around, but the woods were silent, still. It was as if time itself had stopped. That's when he saw it, a trail of blood smeared across the asphalt leading toward the woods. "Jesus Christ," Jack whispered under his breath. He felt his stomach turn as he suddenly realized the road ahead was no longer familiar. The trees, the ground, the very air seemed to be shifting around him. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. His hands shook as he fumbled for his phone, trying to call for help, but there was still no signal. Then, as if on cue, the truck's engine sputtered. Jack looked down in panic. The gas gauge had dropped to empty. He hadn't noticed how quickly it had drained, and now he was stuck, alone in the middle of nowhere, with no way to get help. The air grew colder. A sound like footsteps echoed through the woods, soft at first but growing louder. Jack's breath caught in his throat. He turned to look out the window, but there was nothing there, no one. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw the figure again, the man standing in the woods, staring at him with hollow, dark eyes. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he started the truck again, desperate to get away. But no matter how hard he pressed the gas pedal, the truck remained still, as if the engine had seized. The figure began to move closer, its face hidden beneath the hood. It was walking slowly, deliberately, toward the truck. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he realized, in that moment, the terrible truth. He wasn't on a road to Hollow Creek. He was on a road to nowhere. And the man, the figure, was coming to claim him. It was a crisp autumn evening when Jason and his friends decided to take a road trip across the country. They had been planning this for months, a week-long adventure, driving through small towns, stopping at diners, and camping under the stars. Their route took them along Interstate 89, a stretch of highway that wound through the mountains of Vermont, one of the oldest and most remote areas in Jason, who had a love for dark history and obscure tales, had read about the strange things people had experienced on this very road. From ghostly apparitions to inexplicable crashes and eerie sightings, there were whispers of something sinister lurking just beyond the edge of the highway. Jason's friends laughed it off, chalking it up to local folklore, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that the degree the off. "You know, there's this legend about this highway," Jason said, trying to break the tension. "People say the road's haunted by a ghostly figure, an old woman who walks alone on the shoulder, waiting for a ride." "But when you come on, man," Mark laughed, his voice tight with unease. "You're not buying," Jason shrugged, but deep down, he wasn't so sure. They had been driving for hours with no sign of civilization, and something about the atmosphere seemed unnature. The mist thickened as they drove further, reducing visibility to a few feet. Every turn in the road seemed to bring a new wave of discomfort, and Jason couldn't help but notice how eerily quiet it had become. There were no animals, no sounds of distant traffic, nothing but the hum of their engine and the rustling of trees that sounded. Suddenly, without warning, a figure appeared in the headlights. "Mark, brake!" Jason shouted, his heart leaping into his throat. Mark slammed the brakes, and the car screeched to a halt, the tires skidding on the slick pavement. The figure, a woman in a tattered grey dress, stood motionless on the side of the road. Her long hair hung in tangled strands covering her face. She didn't move, didn't blink. She just stared into the fog, her figure barely discernible through the haze. "What the hell?" Mark said, his voice shaky. "She came out of nowhere." Jason's instincts kicked in, and before anyone could say anything, he was already opening the car door. "I'm going to see if she's okay," he said. "No way," Sarah, his girlfriend, whispered. "It's too dangerous out there. Let's just go, please." But Jason was already stepping into the mist, his feet crunching on the gravel shoulder of the road. The air was cold and damp, sending a shiver through him. As he approached the woman, the sound of his footsteps seemed unnaturally loud, echoing in the silence. "Hey, are you all right?" he called out, his voice tentative. The woman didn't respond. Her back was turned to him, but Jason could feel her presence. He was close now, just a few feet away. As he reached out a hand to tap her on the shoulder, something in his gut screamed at him to stop, but it was too late. The woman spun around, her face now visible in the headlights. Her skin was pale, stretched tight over sharp bones, and her eyes were empty like black holes staring into his soul. There was no emotion, no life, just an unnerving stillness. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Only a deafening scream filled the air. The sound seemed to vibrate through the very earth beneath him, rattling his teeth and making the hair on his neck stand on end. In that instant, Jason's body froze, his heart pounding in his chest as if it would burst. He could feel an icy hand grip his heart, paralyzing him with fear. The woman's scream grew louder, more distorted, like the sound of someone being torn apart. "Jason, get back in the car," Mark yelled. his voice distant, but Jason couldn't move. He was frozen in place, locked in the gaze of those empty eyes. Then, as quickly as it had started, everything went silent. The woman was gone. There was no sign of her anywhere. The fog hung thick in the air, but the road was once again eerily still. Jason stumbled backward, his heart racing, and rushed back to the car, his legs weak. When he slammed the door shut behind him, his friends were staring at him wide-eyed. "What the hell happened?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Jason could barely find the words. She disappeared. Right in front of me. She was a ghost." Mark didn't say anything for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel. The air in the car felt heavy, suffocating. "We need to get off this road," Mark said finally, his voice tight. "Now." But as they tried to turn the car around, the road seemed to stretch endlessly in front of them. The fog was thicker now, and no matter which way they went, they couldn't escape it. It was as though they were trapped in some sort of twisted loop. Hours seemed to pass, though the clock on the dashboard never moved. The roads they passed all seemed familiar, yet somehow different. Each time they passed the same stretch of road, the same trees, it felt as though they were going in circles. Then, in the distance, Jason saw something that sent his blood running cold. A figure on the side of the road, a woman in a grey dress. "She's back," Jason whispered, staring at the figure in horror. Mark slammed on the brakes again, but this time they didn't stop. The car skidded off the road, slamming into the trees, and everything went black. The next morning, the car was found on the side of the highway, overturned, with no sign of the passengers. The only thing the police found was a single weathered photograph of a woman standing by the side of the road, the same woman Jason had seen. And to this day, people who drive down Route 89 late at night claim to see her, the ghostly figure waiting by the roadside, forever trapped in the fog. No one knows exactly who she was or why she haunts the highway, but there are those who say if you're unlucky enough to stop and help her, you'll never leave the highway at all. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, a thin, winding ribbon of asphalt cutting through the desolate wilderness. The headlights of Olivia's car sliced through the darkness, illuminating the occasional signpost or faded mile marker. It was late, far too late for a road trip, but she had no choice. Her car's engine hummed steadily, but the eerie silence of the empty road gave the feeling that she wasn't truly alone. Olivia was heading back from a small town where she'd spent the weekend visiting a friend. The drive was supposed to take about 3 hours, but there was something unsettling about this stretch of road, a notorious highway that locals ref people warned her about it. They said it was cursed. The wind whispered of strange disappearances, car accidents, and unexplained phenomena. Olivia laughed it off, dismissing it as rural superstition. The night was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of the trees on the side of the road, their skeletal branches shaking in the wind. As she continued down the highway, the temperature seemed to drop, and a thick fog rolled in, making her grip the steering wheel a little tighter. Her phone was barely getting any signal, and the eerie feeling that had been creeping up her spine grew stronger. She tried not to let it bother her, but the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught her eye, a shadow darting across the road ahead. She slammed on the brakes, heart pounding. The car screeched to a halt, and her pulse raced. She looked around, but the road was empty. "Just a deer," she whispered to herself, trying to convince herself. She exhaled slowly, her fingers trembling slightly on the wheel. Still, the unsettling feeling lingered in the pit of her stomach. There was something wrong here, something she couldn't put her finger on. Olivia tried to shake off the unease and continued driving, the fog growing thicker with every mile. It was as though the world outside her car had ceased to exist, swallowed up by the heavy mist. After what felt like an eternity, she saw something in the distance, a flickering light, like a lantern or a torch, moving slowly from side to side. Curiosity got the better of her, and she slowed down as she approached. As she neared, the light came into full view, a man hunched over and walking in the middle of the road. His clothes were tattered, and his movements were jerky, as though he were in pain or perhaps not entirely human. Olivia's heart skipped a beat. She hesitated for a moment, but then she told herself it was just a hitchhiker, a person lost in the fog. She had seen enough horror movies to know this was a bad idea, but what choice did she have? She rolled down the window slightly and called out, "Hey, are you okay?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, he turned slowly, his face hidden in the shadows. Olivia felt a chill run through her. There was something about the way he stood that was unnatural. His head tilted at an odd angle, as if he were listening to something only he could hear. "Sir," Olivia said again, her voice wavering, "do you need help?" The figure took a step forward, then another, slowly inching closer. She could make out the sound of his footsteps on the asphalt, but there was something strange about them, too slow, too deliberate. Her instinct screamed at her to drive away, but before she could react, the figure lunged forward, slamming his hand against the hood of her car. Olivia gasped and jerked her foot to the accelerator, the tires screeching as she sped away, her breath coming in short gasps. Her pulse was racing. She glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure was gone, swallowed by the fog as if he had never been there. Olivia's hands shook as she drove faster, trying to shake off the fear, but the road seemed to stretch on endlessly. Then, as if mocking her earlier worries, the radio static kicked in, crackling to life. She reached over to turn it off, but the voice that emerged from the speakers froze her blood. "Turn around. It's not too late. Turn around." The voice was faint at first, but it grew louder, distorted, echoing in the car. It sounded almost like her own voice, but it wasn't. The static crackled and distorted, making it impossible to understand the rest of the message. She slammed the button to turn off the radio, but it wouldn't stop. Desperation clawed at her chest. With one hand she grabbed the wheel, and with the other she fumbled with the radio knobs, trying to silence the voice. Nothing worked. She looked back at the road ahead, and for a split second she thought she saw headlights. A car? But it was no ordinary car. Its lights were too bright, and it was moving toward her with unnatural speed. The rumble of an engine grew louder, and before she knew it, the car was right behind her. Olivia's heart raced as she pushed the pedal to the floor, but the pursuing car stayed with her, no matter how fast she went. The fog seemed to swallow the road, and the visibility grew worse by the second. She glanced at the rearview mirror again. Nothing. The car was gone, but that didn't mean she was alone. Out of nowhere, a figure appeared in the middle of the road, standing motionless, blocking her path. Olivia slammed the brakes. The car skidded and veered off the road, coming to a halt just inches from the figure. She scrambled out of the car, heart hammering in her chest. She was breathing heavily, trying to calm herself, but the figure didn't move. She looked at the person, or what she thought was a person. It was the same man she had seen before, standing motionless in the middle of the road. "Who are you?" Olivia's voice cracked. The figure didn't respond. Slowly, it began to walk toward her, its movements jerky and disjointed. With every step, it seemed to grow taller, the air around it growing colder. She stumbled backward, fear locking her in place. "What do you want from me?" The figure reached out, its long skeletal fingers brushing her cheek. For a brief moment, Olivia felt as though she was staring into the abyss itself, the cold, dead eyes of the figure searching deep into her soul. The world around her seemed to vanish. The fog thickened, enveloping her in darkness. She heard whispers, too faint to understand, but they filled her ears like a song she couldn't escape. The cold was unbearable, and then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. Olivia stood alone in the middle of the highway, shaking and drenched in cold sweat. The fog had lifted. The road was empty. The silence was deafening. She quickly climbed back into her car, heart still racing. Without looking back, she drove away, desperate to leave the highway behind. She drove for hours, not stopping until she reached the first sign of civilization. When she told the locals about what had happened, they just nodded solemnly. "Did you see the figure on the road?" one of them asked. Olivia nodded. "That's why we call it the Hollow. Those who stop there never leave, and those who do, they change. You're lucky to have made it out." She shuddered at the thought, but the worst was yet to come. As she left the gas station and drove off, she glanced at her rearview mirror one last time, and saw, just for a moment, the figure standing at the edge of the road, watching her leave. The Hollow was never far behind. There are roads, and then there are roads. The kind that you take when you don't really know where you're going, or maybe when you're trying to escape something. It's the late-night drives when everything outside is swallowed by darkness. The fog crawls over the asphalt like a thick, inescapable blanket, and the only light you see is from your headlights cutting through the void. For Jesse, Route 73 had always been one of those roads, the kind that felt both comforting and unnerving in equal measure. Jesse had been working long hours at a marketing firm in the city, trapped in a constant loop of conference calls, presentations and email chains. He had never been someone who liked the rush of urban life. He hated the noise, the crowds, and the endless pressure to always be on the go. So, when he finally got the chance to leave town for a weekend, he jumped at it. A few days at his uncle's cabin in the mountains was exactly what he needed. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just nature and quiet. It wasn't the first time Jesse had driven out to the cabin, but this time something felt off. The weather had been stormy for the past few days, and as he pulled onto Route 73, the familiar stretch of highway he'd travelled countless times before, the fog was thicker than usual. It was the kind of fog that seemed to come out of nowhere, wrapping itself around the road, swallowing up the fields on either side. His headlights barely pierced the mist, and the low, distant hum of his engine was the only sound he could hear. Jesse glanced at the clock, 11:45 p.m. It would take him about another hour to get to the cabin, but he was already feeling exhausted. The drive had been longer than usual, and the isolation of the highway was starting to wear on him. Every time he glanced at the rearview mirror, he thought he saw something, someone, in the distance behind him. But whenever he looked directly, the road was empty. It was probably just the fog playing tricks on him. He shook his head, trying to shake off the unease, and turned up the radio, hoping the music would drown out his thoughts. But that didn't work either. The static was back, the same static he'd noticed when he first turned it on, making the song barely audible. Jesse cursed under his breath and adjusted the dial. It was only when he stopped fiddling with the knobs that he noticed the silence, the total unnerving quiet around him. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just the sound of his tyres rolling across the wet road. That's when he saw it. About a quarter mile ahead, a figure stood on the side of the road. A man, or something that looked like one. He was dressed in an old, tattered coat, his face obscured by the brim of a weathered hat. His hands hung limply by his sides, and his posture was unnaturally stiff. Jesse slowed down, uncertain of whether to stop or drive past. The figure remained completely still. Jesse's instincts screamed at him to keep driving, but he couldn't bring himself to look away. It wasn't just that the figure seemed out of place, it was that it shouldn't have been there. This part of the highway was completely isolated. No houses for miles, no reason for anyone to be standing in the middle of the night in the rain. He rolled down the window a little, and the cold, damp air hit him like a slap. The figure didn't move. Jesse felt a cold chill crawl up his spine, but he was still trying to convince himself that it was nothing. Maybe the guy was just a hitchhiker, maybe stranded or in need of help. Jesse wasn't a complete jerk. He couldn't just drive by and ignore someone in need, right? He pulled over a little further down the road, just far enough to avoid blocking the highway. The headlights cut through the fog, illuminating the figure for a moment. As Jesse opened the door to step out, the air seemed to grow even colder. The fog, if anything, had thickened. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever this encounter was going to be. But as soon as his foot hit the gravel, the figure moved. Not toward him, but backward. Just a few inches at first, then a few more, until it was halfway across the road, turning its body in the opposite direction, its movements jerky and unnatural, like someone pulling a puppet on strings. Jesse froze. His heart hammered in his chest. It was like something had triggered his fight or flight response all at once, and he wasn't sure whether to run, hide, or just get the hell out of there. The figure wasn't acting like a person. It was moving like an automaton, twitching and jerking, its head slowly turning toward him with the same unnerving stiffness. Jesse reached for the door handle to get back into his car, but before he could touch it, the figure suddenly turned around, standing completely still again. There was no sound, no footsteps, just the eerie stillness. But this time Jesse couldn't look away. His eyes were locked on the figure, waiting for it to move again. Then, in a voice that barely reached him over the fog, the figure spoke. "Don't. Turn around." Jesse felt a shiver race down his spine. He froze. He couldn't even move. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to leave, to run. but his body was frozen in place. "Don't turn around." The words echoed in his head like a mantra, and though he didn't know why, he knew he had to listen. He stood there, paralyzed for what felt like hours. The only thing he could hear was his own breath, ragged and shallow. And then, just as suddenly as the figure had appeared, it was gone, vanished into the fog. Jesse blinked, wondering if it had been a hallucination. Maybe the stress of the long day had gotten to him. Maybe it was the lack of sleep. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. He slammed the car door shut and put it in gear, his hands trembling as he drove forward, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. He couldn't bring himself to check if the figure was still there, if it was following him. The road ahead was still empty. For the next several minutes, Jesse pushed the accelerator harder, trying to put as much distance as possible between himself and whatever had just happened. But every so often, he'd catch a glimpse of something in the corner of his eye, something just out of his line of sight, moving in the fog. He could hear the faintest whisper on the wind, and his blood ran cold. "Don't turn around." It was a voice that haunted him, that stayed with him, even after the figure was gone. Jesse had no idea who or what he had just encountered, but it wasn't just the man that disturbed him. It was the feeling of being watched, the feeling that whatever that thing was, it was still out there, just beyond the reach of his headlights. By the time Jesse reached his uncle's cabin, he had nearly convinced himself it was just a figment of his imagination. Maybe he had simply been too tired, too wound up. He pulled into the gravel driveway, his hands still shaking as he turned off the engine. But as he stepped out of the car, he glanced back at the road, and for just a split second, in the fog, he thought he saw something. A figure standing by the side of the highway, its face still hidden in the shadows of the brimmed hat. And once again, the whisper came, carried on the wind. "Don't turn around." Jesse didn't hesitate this time. He ran into the cabin and locked the door behind him. He stayed inside that night, the lights on, the doors locked tight. But no matter how hard he tried to sleep, the whisper echoed in his mind, and the fog, thick and heavy, never seemed to lift from the stretch of Route 73. In the morning, when Jesse drove back to town, he passed the spot where he had seen the figure. There was nothing there now. No sign of the strange man, no trace of anything unusual. But the unease never left him. And every time Jesse drives down Route 73 now, when the fog starts to roll in and the road stretches empty ahead, he can't shake the feeling that something, someone, is watching him, waiting for him to turn around. It was the last stretch of a long and grueling road trip, and Jason had never been more ready to reach his destination. The sun had dipped below the horizon hours ago, and the headlights of his car were now the only source of light cutting through the thick fog that had descended on Highway 33. The highway itself was as desolate as it got, a two-lane road cutting through miles of open fields, thick woods, and the occasional abandoned gas station. Jason had always preferred quiet, back-road routes over bustling interstates, but tonight, even he felt unsettled by the eeriness of the empty road. He had been on the road for over 8 hours, driving from his old college town back to the city where he now lived. His destination was still about 50 miles away, but there was a sense of dread gnawing at him, and it wasn't just from the long hours behind the wheel. Something about this stretch of highway, particularly at night, seemed to carry an unsettling vibe, a feeling that something wasn't right. But Jason shrugged it off, telling himself it was just exhaustion and his overactive imagination. After all, he had driven through here hundreds of times before, and nothing had ever happened. But tonight felt different. He checked the time on his dashboard clock, 1:23 a.m. The only sound in the car was the hum of the tyres on the asphalt, and the occasional creak of the steering wheel as he adjusted his grip. The radio had been static for the past half hour, so he switched it off and rolled the window down a crack to let in the cool night air. The fog was thick, swirling in waves, giving the road an almost dreamlike quality. The trees lining the highway were barely visible, their shapes distorted by the mist, and the road seemed to stretch on forever, endless and unchanging. Jason rubbed his eyes, feeling the weight of the day settle in. He just wanted to get home. The bright lights of the city were still miles away, and all he wanted was to pull into his driveway, climb into bed, and sleep for a solid 12 hours. But the fog, thick and suffocating, was making the journey more challenging than it should have been. As he rounded a bend, something caught his eye in the distance. At first, he thought it was another vehicle, but as he got closer, he realized it wasn't. A figure, dressed in a long coat, was standing by the side of the road. At first glance, it looked like a person, but there was something wrong with it. The figure stood completely still, unmoving, as if frozen in time. Jason felt a chill run down his spine, and for a moment he considered speeding up and driving past. But then, as he neared, the figure shifted slightly, turning its head toward him. The movement was subtle, but it was enough to make Jason's heart race. His instincts screamed at him to keep driving, to ignore the figure and just keep moving. But something about the way it stood there, so perfectly still in the fog, made him hesitate. He slowed the car down, rolling the window all the way down. "Hey, are you okay?" he called out into the fog, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. The figure didn't respond. Jason's grip tightened on the wheel, and for a second he wondered if he should stop to offer help. But then, as if in response to his indecision, the figure took a step forward, blocking the road. Jason's heart skipped a beat. Panic surged through him. His foot hovered over the brake, but the road was too narrow to turn around. The fog was so thick that he couldn't see if there were any other vehicles behind him. But the silence that surrounded him felt oppressive. The figure was now standing directly in front of the car, only a few feet away, still not moving. Its face was obscured by a dark, wide-brimmed hat, and the rest of its body was cloaked in tattered rags that hung from its frame like a veil. Jason's breath caught in his throat as the fog seemed to grow thicker, swirling around the figure like a living thing. He couldn't see its eyes, but he felt its presence as though it were watching him, studying him. A sudden wave of dread washed over him, and he had an overwhelming urge to drive away, to escape whatever this thing was. But he couldn't. The figure took another step forward, this time closer to the front of the car. Jason slammed on the brakes, and the car screeched to a halt just inches away from it. The fog thickened, and he could barely see anything beyond the windshield. In a panic, Jason threw the car into reverse, but before he could move, the figure raised one bony hand and pointed directly at him. The motion was slow, deliberate, like the hand was moving through molasses. Jason froze, his breath catching in his throat. His mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. He should have driven away the moment he saw the figure, but now it was too late. Whatever this was, it wasn't human. It didn't belong here. Before Jason could make another move, the figure took one last step forward, and just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, vanishing into the fog as if it had never been there. The road in front of him was once again empty, the mist swallowing the figure whole. Jason sat there, frozen, heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The silence around him felt like a weight pressing in on him, making it harder and harder to think. He looked at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing there, staring at him from the darkness. But there was nothing. The road was empty. Without thinking, he slammed the car into drive and sped off, the tires screeching as he floored the accelerator. His mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. He couldn't explain it. He didn't want to. All he wanted was to get out of there, to escape whatever it was that had just crossed his path. But as he drove, the fog didn't seem to lift. It clung to the road, growing thicker and denser with every mile. And every time Jason looked into the rearview mirror, he thought he saw something, just for a second, moving in the mist behind him. A shadow, a shape. He couldn't make it out clearly, but it was there, watching him. 15 minutes later, Jason reached the next town. The fog was still heavy, but the eerie feeling that had plagued him on the highway began to dissipate. He pulled into a gas station, hoping to calm his nerves. The attendant inside barely looked up as he walked in, his eyes glued to the television screen. Jason tried to act casual as he grabbed a bottle of water from the cooler, but his mind kept replaying the scene on the highway. Was it real? Was it just a trick of the fog? Or had he encountered something much darker than he could understand? When he went to pay, the attendant glanced at him for the first time. "Crazy night out there, huh?" the attendant said, his voice low. "I heard there's a ghost on Highway 33. Old story. A hitchhiker, they say. She was killed there years ago, and people say she still walks that road, waiting for someone to help her." Jason froze. "What?" he asked. his voice barely a whisper. "Yeah," the attendant continued, his eyes still locked on the screen. "She was murdered by a trucker, dumped right off the side of the road. Some people think she's still out there, wandering, looking for a ride. Maybe you were just unlucky enough to run into her." Jason's stomach turned. He didn't want to believe it, didn't want to think about what he had seen, but deep down he knew the truth. Whatever it was on Highway 33, it wasn't human, and it wasn't the last time it would cross his path. It had been a long, exhausting week for Ryan, the kind of week where everything seemed to pile up, meetings, deadlines, and endless emails. By Friday evening, he was more than ready to escape the city, if only for a few hours. His plan was simple: drive down to his family's cabin in the woods, a quiet place where he could relax, unwind, and forget about the chaos of the world. The cabin was just a couple of hours away, nestled off a quiet, secluded highway, a place that hadn't changed in years. Ryan had made the drive countless times. He knew the route well, even the stretches of road where the trees grew so dense it felt like he was driving through a tunnel of branches. The deep, dark woods surrounding the highway had always been oddly calming, and over the years he had come to appreciate the solitude of this route. It was his own little slice of peace. But tonight, something was different. The sun had long since set by the time Ryan left the city, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the deserted highway. The city's lights quickly faded behind him, replaced by the soft hum of his car's engine and the occasional chirp of a lone cricket. The night was quiet, too quiet, and the further he drove, the more unsettled he felt. The highway, usually well lit and easy to follow, had started to feel unfamiliar. The familiar landmarks were absent: no cars, no signs, no bright streetlights. The road stretched endlessly ahead, winding through thick woods that seemed to close in on both sides. Ryan shrugged it off. He had been on this highway plenty of times before. It was just the isolation that made it feel strange tonight. He glanced at the GPS on his phone, but it had no signal. The little no service icon was flashing in the corner of the screen. That wasn't unusual in these parts. The signal was spotty, especially as the road twisted deeper into the woods. Ryan muttered a curse under his breath, but he wasn't too worried. He knew the route well enough to navigate without it. But the road ahead began to change. The once smooth asphalt started to crack, the edges rough and uneven. He gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles white as the car jolted over the bumps. As he rounded a sharp bend, he noticed something in the distance, a sign. He hadn't seen a road sign in miles, and it made him feel oddly relieved. Maybe the worst of the road was behind him. But as he drew closer, Ryan's stomach churned. The sign was rusted, almost as if it hadn't been touched in years. The paint was peeling, and the letters were barely legible. He had to squint to make out the words, and even then, it didn't make sense. Black Hollow, 10 miles. Ryan furrowed his brow. He'd driven this road hundreds of times, and he had never seen any mention of Black Hollow before. It wasn't on any maps, at least not the ones he had checked. The name itself felt wrong, unsettling. Black Hollow? It sounded like something out of a ghost story. But curiosity got the better of him. Ryan decided to continue on. After all, it was just a place on the map, a turn-off he hadn't noticed before. Nothing to worry about, right? He pressed the gas pedal down a little harder, hoping to make it past whatever this strange place was and get to the cabin. But the trees grew even thicker. The road narrowed and the shadows seemed to lengthen. The once comforting darkness now felt oppressive, suffocating. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. As he drove on, the headlights of his car flickered, casting brief, fleeting shadows across the road. Ryan cursed under his breath again and switched on the high beams, hoping they would illuminate more of the road ahead. The trees were closing in now, the forest thick and dense. He could no longer see much beyond the beams of his headlights. Then he saw something up ahead, just at the edge of the trees, a figure standing motionless by the side of the road. Ryan's heart skipped a beat. The figure was tall, wrapped in a heavy coat, its face hidden in the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. It didn't move as Ryan's car drew closer. He slammed on the brakes, instinctively slowing down, his foot hovering over the gas. The figure didn't acknowledge the car. It just stood there, unmoving, its body silhouetted against the dark backdrop of the woods. The strange thing was, as Ryan passed, he didn't hear the crunch of gravel beneath the figure's feet. No movement, no rustling of clothing, It was as if the figure was a part of the night itself. Ryan's stomach twisted. He was about to look away, to keep driving, but something made him glance at the figure in his rearview mirror. It was gone. Just like that. Vanished. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. He didn't want to stop to investigate. It was probably some weirdo out for a walk, right? Nothing to worry about. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. There was an eerie stillness in the air, and the quiet of the woods felt too oppressive, too unnatural. His gut told him he shouldn't be here, but he couldn't turn back now. The cabin was close, just a few more miles. He had driven this road hundreds of times before, and it was always safe. Nothing strange had ever happened. This time would be no different. He tried to reassure himself as he pressed on, but as he drove further into the woods, something began to change. The trees seemed to twist unnaturally, their branches reaching toward the road, bending in ways that didn't seem possible. The air grew colder, and the faint hum of his car's engine sounded like it was muffled, as though it were being absorbed by the night itself. Every now and then, Ryan caught glimpses of movement out of the corner of his eye, shadows flitting between the trees, but when he looked directly, there was nothing there. He checked his rearview mirror again. This time he froze. The figure was back. It was standing in the middle of the road, directly in his path. Ryan slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt just inches from the figure. His heart raced as he stared at it, the figure now closer than before. It didn't move, it didn't speak, but this time Ryan could make out something strange, a faint, unnatural glow coming from beneath the brim of its hat, like a pair of glowing eyes. He couldn't breathe, he couldn't move. The figure's head slowly turned toward him, its eyes piercing the darkness. Ryan felt an ice-cold shiver run down his spine. "Turn back," the figure whispered, its voice low and hollow, as though it were coming from the depths of the earth itself. Ryan's mind raced, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He knew he needed to go. He had to get away. But something was holding him there, like an invisible force that rooted him to the spot. He tried to start the car, but the engine refused to turn over. His hands shook as he fumbled with the keys. "Turn back now," the voice repeated, louder this time, almost a growl. Without thinking, Ryan threw the car into reverse and stomped on the gas. The car lurched backward, and he didn't stop until he was back on the main road. He didn't dare look in the rearview mirror again. He just drove, faster than he'd ever driven before, not even sure where he was going. As the road stretched on, the trees began to thin out. The oppressive darkness seemed to lift, and the familiar highway signs appeared once again, but the sense of unease remained, lingering in his chest like a heavy weight. When Ryan finally reached the town, he pulled into the first gas station he saw. His hands were still trembling as he turned off the engine and stepped out of the car. He tried to shake off the feeling of dread, but it wouldn't go away. The gas station attendant looked at him strangely when he walked in. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said with a half smile. "You okay?" Ryan didn't know how to answer. He didn't know what had just happened. "Where exactly is Black Hollow?" Ryan asked, his voice shaky. The attendant frowned, his smile fading. "You don't want to go there," he said. "That place, it's cursed. No one who goes there ever comes back. The road's been abandoned for years now." Ryan didn't need to hear more. He turned and walked out of the station, the weight of what he had seen pressing down on him. Black Hollow, the figure, the voice. He would never go back. But as he drove home, the glow of the figure's eyes haunted him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still watching him from the shadows. The sun had long disappeared beneath the horizon, and the sky was now a blanket of deep purple, stretching across the landscape. The headlights of Thomas's old truck were the only source of light on the empty highway, casting long, eerie shadows across the asphalt. He had been driving for what seemed like hours, alone on the desolate stretch of road, far from any town or sign of life. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. Thomas had never intended to be out here so late. He had taken a detour on his way back to the city, wanting to explore the back roads and avoid the usual traffic. But now, as the hours wore on, he started to feel uneasy. The road was narrowing, winding through dense woods that seemed to close in on him from all sides. The air was thick with an unsettling stillness, and the occasional rustling in the underbrush made his skin crawl. He glanced at his GPS. There was no signal. The map showed nothing but miles of empty highway and thick forest. He had driven through some remote parts of the state before, but this felt different. It was as if the road itself had swallowed him up, and he was now in some otherworldly place, isolated and alone. The truck's engine sputtered for a moment, and Thomas's heart skipped a beat. He pressed the gas pedal harder, willing the engine to keep going. It had been acting up lately, but he hadn't had the time or money to get it fixed. As if in response to his unspoken prayer, the truck roared back to life, but the sound seemed wrong, too loud, too hollow. He cursed under his breath, glancing nervously at the side of the road. The trees there were thick and dark, their twisted branches reaching out like claws. There were no signs, no mile markers, nothing to tell him where he was. The air grew colder, and his breath began to fog up the windshield. That's when he saw it. A figure standing by the side of the road. At first he thought it might be a person, maybe a hitchhiker. But as he got closer, something about the figure didn't seem right. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its posture was stiff, almost mechanical. The figure stood motionless, facing the woods, its back to Thomas. It was draped in a tattered coat, the fabric torn and frayed. Its head was bowed as though it were deep in thought, or perhaps waiting. Thomas slowed the truck, instinctively feeling the hair on the back of his neck rise. A strange feeling washed over him, a feeling he couldn't quite explain, something between dread and fascination. He thought about stopping, but a voice in his head told him to keep driving. But it was too late. Just as Thomas was about to pass the figure, it turned toward the truck, its face hidden beneath a hood. The eyes, or rather the empty sockets where eyes should have been, stared right through him. The air grew even colder, and for a split second the entire world seemed to freeze. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. He hit the accelerator, the truck lurching forward as he sped away from the figure. His hands gripped the wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He didn't dare look in the rearview mirror, but the sense of being watched gnawed at him, relentless and suffocating. The road ahead seemed to stretch on forever, the dark trees pressing closer. But then, as if mocking his fear, the truck began to sputter again. The engine's roar faded, replaced by a low, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the entire vehicle. "What now?" Thomas muttered, his voice shaky. He slammed his hand on the dashboard in frustration. The truck came to a slow halt, and the headlights flickered before going out completely. He was now in total darkness, alone and helpless in the middle of nowhere. He tried restarting the engine, but it didn't respond. Panic began to rise in his chest. The silence around him was thick, oppressive, and filled with a sense of dread. Something was out there, lurking just beyond the edges of the headlights, watching him, waiting for him to make a move. Then, out of the darkness, there was a sound, a faint tapping on the window. Thomas's blood ran cold. Slowly he turned his head, and there, standing just outside the driver's side window, was the figure from before. Its face was still hidden beneath the hood, but now it was closer, so close that he could see the faint outline of its features. The tapping continued, soft and rhythmic, like a slow, deliberate countdown. "Go away!" Thomas shouted, his voice shaking. But the figure didn't move. Instead, it reached out, its long, skeletal fingers pressing against the glass. The window didn't fog up from his breath, but a thick condensation began to form on the inside of the truck, as though the very air was being drawn out of the vehicle. Thomas backed away, his body frozen with fear. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as though the figure was demanding his attention. And then, in a voice that was both distant and right next to his ear, the figure spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." Thomas's heart raced. He couldn't move. His mind screamed at him to drive, to escape, but his body wouldn't respond. The figure's words echoed in his mind, a cold, hollow warning. "You should have turned around," the voice continued, "before it was too late." The condensation on the window swirled into strange, almost human-like shapes, forming a face that wasn't his own. Thomas's breath caught in his throat as the face in the window seemed to leer at him, its eyes now wide and empty, like the figure's. And then, with a screech of tires and the sudden roar of an engine, The truck lurched forward. The headlights flickered back to life, blindingly bright, and the figure was gone. Thomas didn't look back. He slammed his foot on the gas and sped down the highway, the truck roaring back to life as if nothing had happened. He didn't care to check the rearview mirror, nor did he stop for miles, the eerie stillness of the road pressing down on him with every passing second. But as he neared the next town, something strange happened. The road ahead no longer looked familiar. The trees on either side were different, the signs were missing, and the highway stretched into an unfamiliar stretch of forest. He had driven this route before many times, he knew it well, but now it was as though the road had changed. The fog had returned, thick and heavy, blanketing everything in sight. His hands trembled on the steering wheel as he glanced around. The roads, the trees, the sky. It was all wrong. This wasn't the same place he had been driving through earlier. Something had shifted, and then, just up ahead, he saw it again. The figure, standing by the side of the road, tall, unmoving. The truck's headlights flickered, and for a split second the figure's hooded face seemed to grin. Thomas slammed the brakes and twisted the steering wheel, trying to turn off the road, but it was too late. The truck swerved, skidding off the road and crashing into the trees. The last thing he saw before everything went dark was the figure, standing in the distance, watching him with empty, hollow eyes. The next morning the highway was quiet, as it always was. No sign of Thomas's truck, no sign of his struggle, just the road, empty, stretching on into the dark, misty forest, and in the distance the figure watched. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend drive, just a quick getaway from the chaos of the city, but for Sarah, what should have been a peaceful escape turned into a nightmare that would haunt her for the rest of her life. It all began on Route 89, a desolate stretch of road that cut through the remote hills of Tennessee. A road she had driven before, but this time, things would be different. Sarah had been living in Nashville for the past 5 years. The city was exciting, full of life, but sometimes it felt overwhelming. The constant noise, the crowds, the traffic, it was enough to drive anyone to the brink of insanity. So, when her best friend Claire invited her to spend the weekend at her cabin up in the mountains, Sarah jumped at the chance. A few days of peace and quiet in the middle of nowhere sounded perfect. The drive started out normal enough. Sarah's car hummed along the highway as she left the city behind, heading toward the mountains. She had taken Route 89 many times before. It was the quickest way to get to Claire's cabin. The road was winding and isolated, but Sarah had always found it oddly soothing. The thick trees on either side, the quiet stretch of asphalt, everything about it felt timeless. But this time, the weather was different. The sky had been overcast all day, and as Sarah drove deeper into the mountains, the fog began to roll in. It started as a light mist, but soon the fog thickened, clinging to the road like a blanket, swallowing up the trees and making it impossible to see anything more than a few feet ahead. Sarah turned on her headlights, but they barely made a dent in the fog. The world outside her car felt suffocating, like she was driving through a dream. She glanced at her GPS. Only 20 miles to go. It had been a long day, but she was almost there. She turned the volume up on the radio to keep herself awake, the familiar sounds of a country station playing in the background. The road was quiet, too quiet. No other cars, no trucks, just the hum of her engine and the occasional creak of the trees swaying in the wind. As Sarah drove, she couldn't help but notice something strange. The road, which she had driven many times before, seemed to be different. The signs that used to be clearly visible were now faded, almost unreadable. The pavement, once smooth, now had large cracks running through it, as if the road had been abandoned for years. But that wasn't possible. The highway was still in use, wasn't it? She rubbed her eyes, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that was slowly creeping up on her. The fog was disorienting, and the road looked unfamiliar, even though she had driven it countless times. "Just get through it," she muttered to herself. "It's just the fog messing with your head." But as she continued driving, things only got worse. The fog thickened even more, and the temperature seemed to drop rapidly. Her breath fogged up the windshield, and Sarah had to roll the window down slightly to clear it, her fingers numb from the chill. The radio station started to fade in and out, static buzzing in the air. She twisted the knob in frustration, but the static only grew louder. Then, just when Sarah thought it couldn't get any worse, she saw it. Her foot hovered over the brake pedal, but before she could make up her mind, the figure suddenly turned toward the car. Sarah gasped and slammed on the brakes, heart pounding in her chest. The figure didn't seem to move at all, not even a step, but as she looked closer, she could see something terrifying. The figure was wrong. The face was obscured by a dark hood, but there was something off about the proportions, something unnatural about its posture. Its arms were too long, and its head, tilted at an odd angle, seemed to be staring directly at her. Without thinking, Sarah hit the gas and sped past the figure, her heart racing as the car lurched forward. She didn't look back, afraid of what she might see if she did. The fog closed in around her again, and she forced herself to focus on the road. She couldn't have imagined it. That wasn't possible. But her mind kept replaying the image of the figure, its twisted form, its unnatural stance. She shook her head, trying to clear the thoughts. Minutes passed, and the fog seemed to lift slightly. The trees on either side of the road started to thin out, and Sarah saw a break in the mist ahead. Her GPS pinged, and she saw that she was almost there. Just a few more miles and she would be at Claire's cabin. But when she looked up, her heart dropped into her stomach. The road was empty. No houses, no signs, no familiar landmarks. Just a long stretch of empty asphalt surrounded by dense trees. Panic started to rise in her chest. She had driven this stretch of highway before. She knew this part well. But now, it was different. The road was completely unfamiliar, as though it had somehow changed while she wasn't looking. Her phone buzzed. She glanced down at the screen, relieved to see that Claire had texted her. "Almost there? The cabin is just up the road. Don't stop for anything." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Don't stop for anything. She had never gotten a text like that before. Claire was always casual, always easygoing. That message seemed out of place, and it only heightened Sarah's sense of dread. She took a deep breath and pressed on, hoping to reach the cabin soon and put this strange feeling behind her. The fog had cleared, but now the road stretched endlessly before her, with no end in sight. The trees on either side grew thicker and darker, their branches twisted like gnarled hands reaching out to grab her. Then, through the rearview mirror, she saw it. A set of headlights. Faint at first, but growing closer by the second. Sarah felt a surge of relief. Someone else was on the road. She wasn't alone, but when the headlights grew brighter, she realized something was wrong. The car wasn't passing her. It was getting closer and closer, until, in a moment of panic, Sarah slammed on the brakes, heart in her throat, as the headlights bore down on her. The car didn't stop. It went right through her, passing as though it were a ghost. The bright lights disappeared in the blink of an eye, leaving Sarah sitting in the middle of the road, frozen, her breath coming in short gasps. Her pulse raced as the world around her seemed to spin. That wasn't possible, she thought. The car had passed through hers. It had gone right through her. Suddenly the fog enveloped her again, thicker than before, and she heard a voice, faint like a whisper but clear as day. "Turn back." Sarah slammed the car into reverse, desperate to leave whatever was happening behind. But when she looked into the rearview mirror, she saw the same figure from earlier, standing directly behind her, its head tilted in that grotesque way, its shadow stretching toward her like an unstoppable force. She didn't look back after that. With her heart pounding in her chest, Sarah pressed the gas pedal to the floor, her car speeding down the road, not knowing where it was going but desperate to leave. The fog, the figure, the strange voice, they all seemed to blur together as she tore through the darkness. Finally, she saw a sign up ahead, the familiar lettering of the Route 89 highway sign. She was back on the road she recognized. She slammed on the brakes and pulled over, her hands shaking. Her phone buzzed again. It was Claire's number. "Where are you? I just saw your car go past. You're almost here. The cabin is just up the road." But Sarah was already shaking her head, staring at the fog in disbelief. No matter how many times she drove down that road, there was no escaping what she had seen. The vanishing mile, the one stretch of highway that didn't belong, a place where reality bent and time fractured, and Sarah would never be able to explain why. It was just a regular evening when Jake decided to take the long, lonely stretch of Route 12, a winding country highway that led through the backwoods of southern Ohio. He'd been on this road before, numerous times when work or life in general felt like too much to handle. It was the quiet kind of place that allowed you to think, to clear your head. Little did he know, tonight would change everything. Jake had been working late at the office. The bright fluorescent lights of his cubicle and the hum of his computer screen had drained him. His car, an old Ford Mustang, was a refuge from the chaos of the city. With the highway ahead, Jake had only one thing on his mind: getting home to his small cabin in the woods, where the only sounds were the whispers of the trees and the wind. By the time he left the office, the sun had already dipped below the horizon. The winding road ahead was completely dark, save for his headlights cutting through the thick fog. Route 12 was quiet at this hour. Too quiet. Only a few headlights from trucks and the occasional car passing through every now and then. It was the kind of highway that made you feel as if you were the only person left on Earth. As he drove deeper into the countryside, Jake began to feel a strange sense of unease. It wasn't the fog or the darkness, it was something else. Something that crept in the pit of his stomach, gnawing at him, telling him that tonight wasn't like the other nights. The trees lining the road seemed to loom over him, their branches twisting like dark fingers, reaching out toward the car. He tried to shake off the feeling. "It's just the fog," he muttered to himself. "It's messing with my head." But the feeling didn't go away. A mile or so into the drive, Jake noticed something peculiar. The road signs, usually bright and easy to read, were now barely visible, as if time had worn them down. The reflective paint had chipped away, and some signs were crooked, half hanging off their posts. There were no streetlights along this stretch, just the occasional faint light from an old, decaying farmhouse. He thought he saw something moving in the distance, a shadow, tall and thin, darting between the trees. It seemed to be following him. Jake shook his head. "It's nothing," he muttered, but the unease still gripped him. As he sped along, he could see the mist thickening ahead, swirling in strange, twisting patterns. It was like the fog itself was alive, creeping across the road, curling like a serpent around the tires of his car. The world outside his window became a void, nothing but fog and shadows. And then, just when Jake thought things couldn't get stranger, he saw it. In the middle of the road, a figure stood motionless, bathed in the weak glow of his headlights. A man, tall and thin, wearing a long coat that fluttered slightly in the breeze. His face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but Jake could make out the shape of his hands, pale and long, fingers that seemed too slender, too unnatural. The figure didn't move. It didn't even acknowledge the approaching car. It was like a statue, frozen in time. Jake slammed on the brakes, heart racing. The car skidded slightly on the damp asphalt, but he managed to stop just in time, inches from the figure. His pulse hammered in his ears as he stared at the man in the road. "What the hell?" Jake whispered. The figure remained still, and then, for the briefest moment, the man's head turned slowly toward Jake. But there was no face, just shadow where his features should have been. The empty darkness of the man's face was enough to make Jake's blood run cold. Instinctively, Jake put the car into reverse, his hands trembling as he backed away. But the moment he took his eyes off the figure to shift the car, the figure was gone, vanished. No sign of movement, no sound, just the eerie silence of the fog pressing in. The road was empty again. Jake's breath was shallow, his hands slick with sweat. He didn't want to stay there any longer. There was no explanation for what he had just seen, and he wasn't sure if he wanted one. He pressed the gas pedal down, speeding away, eager to get as far from the figure as possible, but the road ahead was no longer familiar. The trees seemed to stretch higher, their limbs twisting like strange, gnarled hands. The fog thickened, and the headlights barely illuminated the path in front of him. The stretch of highway, which had always been calm and peaceful, now felt oppressive, like something was lurking just out of sight. Jake glanced at the dashboard. He was sure he had passed the turnoff to his cabin by now. His GPS was glitching, the screen flashing erratically as if struggling to keep up with the strange, shifting road. He reached for his phone, but there was no signal. Of course, no one was around for miles, and he hadn't seen another car for what felt like hours. He cursed under his breath. The temperature in the car had dropped sharply, and Jake could see his breath fogging up the window. He rubbed the glass with his sleeve, trying to clear it, but the fog seemed to stay in place, clinging to the inside of the car. It wasn't just on the windows either. The whole air inside the car felt wrong, heavy. He looked over his shoulder, expecting to see the man again, but the road was still empty. Suddenly the car jolted forward and the engine sputtered. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He glanced down at the fuel gauge. It was nearly empty. He couldn't have used that much gas. The drive hadn't been long enough for it to run out. He pulled over to the side of the road, heart pounding. He checked the fuel tank anyway, even though he knew it didn't make sense. It was full, a full tank of gas. He slammed the hood shut, frustration rising. Something was very wrong. That's when he heard it. A voice, faint but unmistakable, whispered from somewhere deep in the fog. It wasn't a voice he recognized, but it was familiar, eerily familiar. "Turn back. You shouldn't be here." Jake froze, his blood running cold. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was a whisper carried on the wind, soft but clear. He felt it slide under his skin, like ice in his veins. "Turn back," the voice repeated, louder this time, as if it was closer. The fog seemed to press against the windows, distorting the view outside. Jake's hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment he considered just driving forward, trying to make it through whatever this was. But the whisper came again, this time urgent, insistent. Turn back. Jake couldn't take it any longer. His mind was screaming at him to go, to leave. He didn't care if he wasn't sure where he was. He just needed to get away. He shoved the gear shift into drive and gunned the engine, tearing down the road at a reckless speed. The fog thickened even more, swirling around his headlights. But Jake kept his foot pressed to the pedal. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting the figure to appear again. But the road was still empty, still silent. Minutes, or maybe hours, later, Jake finally saw a sign. A weathered, almost illegible sign with faded letters. "Welcome to Black Hollow." His blood ran cold. He had seen this sign before, just moments ago. But this wasn't the same road. The trees were different, the shadows darker, and the feeling in the air was heavy, suffocating. The fog began to clear and Jake could finally see the road ahead. But what he saw made his stomach lurch. At the end of the road, a silhouette stood, tall, thin, with a wide-brimmed hat. The man. The same figure. But this time, his face wasn't just shadow. It was empty. Hollow. Jake tried to scream, but no sound came out. His eyes locked with the figures, and he felt himself being drawn in, his vision blurring. And then everything went dark.